The snow in southern Poland that winter of 1944 was strange. It didn't seem to melt, even when the sun brushed against it. It held its white sheen like a secret, like something that refused to soften. I remember, as I once looked at a photograph of that season, men in striped uniforms moving like shadows between wooden barracks, thinking that the snow there was not made of ice, but of ash. That was where Rudolf Vrba lived, or rather, survived, for nearly 2 years. A young Slovak Jew, born Walter Rosenberg, he was only 19 when he was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau. The train that carried him there was filled with whispers and stale air. He remembered the rattle of the wheels, the murmur of prayers, the smell of fear mixed with straw. "I was not afraid," he would later write, "only curious to see if hell really existed." When the train finally stopped, the doors opened to the sound of barking dogs and German voices. The men were lined up. Some were sent to the right, others to the left. Rudolf didn't yet know that this quiet sorting meant life or death. He was given a number, 44,070, and that number became his name. Inside the camp, time dissolved. Days blended into one another, marked only by the dull rhythm of labor and hunger. The air was filled with the scent of burning, not wood, not coal, but something far heavier. "It clung to your skin," one survivor later said, "like invisible soot." Rudolf worked in various sections, unloading transports, collecting belongings, sorting through the piles of shoes and children's clothes. It was there, among the mountains of objects once owned by the dead, that he began to understand the scale of what was happening. He saw names scrawled inside coat collars, tiny shoes belonging to babies, letters that would never be read. The camp, he realized, was not a prison, it was a factory of death. And yet, amid that unthinkable horror, he began to think not only of surviving, but of escaping. He was intelligent, observant. He memorized guard patterns, studied the layout of fences and watchtowers, learned which men might be trusted. He stored information like a historian in the making, as though one day he would be called to testify before the world. I imagine him one evening, standing near the edge of the barracks, looking toward the setting sun, a faint red glow beyond the wire. The sky must have looked almost kind in that moment. "I began to dream," he later wrote, "not of freedom, but of telling others what I had seen." He wasn't alone in this. He would later meet another Slovak prisoner, Alfred Wetzler, a quiet, meticulous man with an engineer's mind. Together they began to plan something no one thought possible, an escape from Auschwitz itself. At night, when the camp fell into uneasy silence and the only sounds were the muffled coughs of exhausted men, they whispered about it. They knew that to fail meant certain death, not only for themselves, but for anyone who might have helped them. Still, they planned. They observed the routines of the guards, the dogs, the search patterns after each attempted escape. They studied the geography of the camp, the fences, the fields, the river, the forests beyond. Vrba began keeping mental notes, numbers, train arrivals, and the symbols painted on incoming transports. He wanted proof, facts, not rumor. If he ever reached the outside world, he would need evidence. For who would believe him otherwise? He remembered a particular moment, perhaps the seed of his decision. A transport from Hungary arrived. Thousands of Jews stepped from the trains, clutching their bundles, looking around for guidance. Many still believed they were being resettled. He saw a small girl clutching a doll. She smiled when a soldier told her to leave her bag on the platform. "They didn't know," he said later, his voice breaking even years after the war. "They didn't know." And so he made a vow to himself, he would live long enough to tell them. Sometimes, when I look at the surviving photographs, the snow, the chimneys, the shadows of men walking in a frozen dawn, I think about that vow. How fragile it must have been, like holding a candle in the wind. Yet it burned still. That night, somewhere deep inside Block 9, Rudolf whispered to Alfred, "We will not die here. We will take the truth with us." Outside, the snow still fell, untouched by warmth. It wasn't winter anymore, but it still looked like it. Segue. And so began a plan that would take weeks to form, one built on silence, courage, and the strange kind of hope that only appears when everything else is gone. In the next part, we enter the hidden corners of Auschwitz, where escape was whispered about but never believed possible. The plan to escape Auschwitz was not a single spark of desperation, but a slow-burning idea, something fragile that needed to be guarded in silence. Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler knew that too much hope could be dangerous in a place designed to crush it. And yet, every night, as the barracks sank into uneasy quiet, the idea returned, like the faint glow of a lantern behind their closed eyes. Auschwitz was a machine of control. Every movement, every breath, was accounted for. The guards patrolled the fences with dogs. The towers held searchlights that swept the snow with mechanical precision. Even the prisoners' minds had been made part of the machinery. Escape was unthinkable. That was the first rule of survival. The second was not to hope. But Rudolf was stubborn. "It was not only a question of saving myself," he would later write, "but of stopping the killing." That thought had become a map in his mind, more detailed than any drawn blueprint. And slowly, over the months, he began to fill in the gaps. They studied everything. The layout of the fences, first the wooden posts, then the double barbed wire, then the high-voltage line humming faintly in the cold air. The rhythm of the guard steps. The feeding times of the dogs. Even the direction of the wind, because if they carried the scent of the camp too strongly, the dogs might catch them. They found a place, a small storage area near the outer edge of Birkenau, where piles of timber and building materials were stacked. Beneath one of those stacks, there was a space, dark, narrow, almost coffin-like. It was there that they planned to hide. For 3 days, they would remain buried under planks and sawdust, still and silent, while the camp searched for them. After 72 hours, when the guards believed they must have escaped far beyond the fences, the search would stop. Only then would they crawl out and make their way towards Slovakia, a journey of nearly 100 miles, across rivers, forests, and enemy patrols. It was madness. But madness was sometimes the only sane response to a world that had lost all reason. They began to gather supplies. From sympathetic prisoners, men in the camp resistance, or those who simply understood without words, they secured scraps of food, a few pieces of bread, dried sausage, sugar, margarine. They even obtained a map, drawn roughly by memory, and a small compass hidden in a piece of bread. Everything was a risk. Every whispered exchange could mean death. And yet, within that darkness, there was something almost tender in how they planned. They spoke quietly, patiently, like craftsmen shaping the outline of something delicate. "We must think of everything," Wetzler would say. "Every sound, every smell." The storage area was prepared with care. They spread tobacco and gasoline around the timber piles to confuse the dogs. They arranged the boards so that air could still seep in, enough to breathe. They even lined part of the space with paper stolen from packaging, to muffle their movements. It was not an escape plan so much as a prayer disguised as one. On April 7, 1944, the time finally came. The evening air was soft, touched by the promise of spring. They moved quickly, almost invisibly, slipping through the gray of twilight. Around them, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle cried, that low, hollow sound that had carried so many into silence. They reached the timber yard and slipped inside their hiding place. The boards closed above them, shutting out the last traces of light. Then came the waiting. The first hours passed easily enough, their hearts pounding, bodies tense, but alive with purpose. They whispered small words to each other, promises, reassurances. But as the hours stretched into days, their world became smaller, heavier. The air turned thick and damp. Hunger came, then thirst. Their limbs cramped. And above them, the sounds of the search began. Dogs barking. Shouts. Footsteps thudding across the ground. The boards creaked as men walked over them. The smell of tobacco and petrol filled their lungs, making them dizzy. Once they heard a dog scratch at the pile above their heads, a terrible moment when they thought it was over. But then the sound moved away. Hours passed. Then silence again. When at last the third night came, the air had turned cold again. They could barely move their legs. Their mouths were dry. But they knew the search would be ending soon. And somewhere deep inside, beyond fear, beyond exhaustion, was the faint ember of triumph. On the morning of April 10th, as dawn rose pale over the camp, they pushed the boards aside and crawled into the open air. The world outside seemed impossibly wide. The grass wet beneath their hands, the sky a color they had almost forgotten, something like blue, but softer, as though the heavens themselves were unsure what to make of them. They were out. But they were not free. Not yet. I imagined them standing there for a brief moment, dizzy, weak, their striped uniforms blending with the mist, and feeling the strange silence of the world beyond the fence. Somewhere behind them, the chimneys still smoked. Ahead, a forest waited, dark, uncertain, but alive. "Now," Vrba whispered. "We walk." Segue. Beyond the fences of Auschwitz, the world felt both too quiet and too large. In the next section, we follow Rudolf and Alfred through forests and fields, hunted by soldiers and dogs, as they move toward a border that promised freedom and the impossible burden of truth. The forest began only a few hundred meters from the edge of the camp, but to Rudolf and Alfred, it might as well have been the mouth of another world. The air was thick with pine and the faint sweetness of thawing earth. After so many months breathing the metallic smoke of Auschwitz, the smell of soil was almost overwhelming, like memory itself, alive and sharp. They crouched low among the trees, their hearts still hammering from the escape. Behind them, the camp's chimneys stood against the pale horizon, their black trails curling into the sky like warning beacons. They dared not look back for long. Every second mattered now. Their plan was simple, at least in theory. Head south by night, follow the Sola River until it met the mountains, then cross into Slovakia. But simplicity on paper often collapses in the forest. They had no proper shoes, only the worn leather scraps they had scavenged from the camp. Their uniforms marked them as prisoners to anyone who saw them. And they carried almost nothing, a few pieces of bread, a compass, a pencil map, and their will to keep walking. The forest was their shield and their tormentor. In daylight they buried themselves under branches and moss, lying still as stones. At night they moved through the undergrowth, guided by the stars and the faint shimmer of the river. The woods seemed endless, a cathedral of trunks and whispering leaves. Sometimes they could hear the barking of dogs far behind them, a reminder that the hunt was still on. They walked in silence. Talking was dangerous, and words felt too fragile anyway. Once they paused by a stream, their reflections trembling in the water. Alfred murmured, "It's strange to see one's own face again." Rudolf only nodded. The last time he truly looked at his reflection, he'd been 19, a boy. Now his eyes looked older, hollowed by things no mirror could forgive. The nights blurred together. Hunger gnawed at them, the cold crept into their bones. They found wild garlic, nettles, a few roots, bitter but edible. When they could risk a small fire, they warmed their hands around it, the faint flame flickering like a fragile secret between them. The smoke rose softly, curling upward through the trees like a prayer. Once, as they huddled beneath a fallen tree trunk, they heard the low hum of engines. Trucks. The sound grew louder, then faded. Soldiers were patrolling the area, probably following orders from the camp commandant. For days afterward, Rudolf and Alfred stayed hidden, moving only when the moon was covered by clouds. I often wonder what they thought about in those hours of silence. Perhaps they imagined home, the smell of bread baking, the chatter of family dinners that now lived only in memory. Or perhaps they thought of the others left behind, the men and women whose names had already been erased by fire. It was for them we kept walking, Rudolf would later say. For the millions who could not. On the fifth night, they reached a small village. Lights flickered faintly through the trees, the first sign of civilization. But civilization was dangerous. The German occupation had turned even the simplest farmhouse into a potential threat. They hid near the edge of the fields, watching. A dog barked once, then again. They moved on. As the days passed, their food dwindled. Their legs trembled. Their hands were raw from thorns. The forest began to feel almost sentient, watching, testing, asking whether they were worthy of escape. In his memoir, Rudolf described the trees as 1,000 mute witnesses. He said that in those nights, he began to understand silence, the kind that could kill or protect, depending on how one used it. Then came the rain. Cold, relentless, turning the forest floor into mud. Their clothes clung to them like a second skin. But the rain, too, was a strange gift. It washed away their scent, hid their tracks, muffled the world. For 2 nights, they walked in it, soaked and shivering, but alive. At one point, they crossed paths with a farmer, a man carrying a lantern, walking his field after dusk. The 3 froze when their eyes met. The farmer's gaze lingered for a moment, then drifted away. He said nothing. Perhaps he understood. Perhaps he had seen too much already. They slipped past him like ghosts. The further they moved from the camp, the more surreal the world became. Villages went about their business, unaware or unwilling to believe what happened just beyond the horizon. In one field, Rudolf saw a girl feeding chickens, her laughter faint on the wind. "How can the world still turn?" he whispered. It was not anger in his voice, but something softer, disbelief, sorrow, all. Finally, after more than a week of walking, they reached the Slovak border. The Carpathian foothills rose before them, dark, mist-covered, and beautiful. They had crossed nearly 80 miles on foot, through enemy territory, with nothing but instinct and each other. They were starving, exhausted, but something inside them stirred again, hope, cautious and fragile. They paused on a ridge, looking down at the fields below. Somewhere beyond those hills lay Zelina, a town where they might find sympathetic countrymen, perhaps even people from the Slovak Jewish Council. If they could reach it, they could tell their story. They could tell the world. But first, they had to survive one more night. The wind was rising now, sharp with spring frost. In the dim light, the forest whispered around them, leaves rustling like old paper, the sound of branches creaking under the moon. It felt as though the forest itself had carried them here, step by step, breath by breath. As they rested on the slope, Alfred turned to Rudolf and murmured, "If we die now, at least we have seen the sky again." Rudolf smiled faintly, though his eyes were heavy. "We won't die," he said. "We still have to speak." And somewhere far behind them, the lights of Auschwitz flickered faintly through the mist, a memory fading but not forgotten. Segue. The forest had kept its promise, but the world beyond it would prove no easier. In the next section, we follow Rudolf and Alfred as they reach Slovakia, and face the impossible task of convincing anyone that their story was true. When Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler finally crossed into Slovakia, They were scarcely recognizable as men. Their striped prison uniforms hung loose from their bones. Their feet were torn, wrapped in rags. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, like wax figures animated by some final, stubborn thread of will. But they had made it. After 11 days of crawling, hiding, walking, and praying, they were standing, alive, in the land of their birth. Freedom, however, is a strange thing. It can feel heavy after so much captivity. The air was cleaner, yes, and the forest quieter, but danger had not vanished. German patrols still moved along the roads. Collaborators still prowled the countryside. A single rumor of 2 escaped Jews from Auschwitz could bring the Gestapo down upon the nearest village. They kept to the woods a little longer, moving at dusk, sleeping by day. Hunger gnawed at them until it became a dull ache that no longer shocked the body. Then, one evening, they saw a farmhouse in the distance, smoke curling gently from its chimney, the scent of burning wood drifting through the cold. Alfred was too weak to walk much further. Rudolf decided to risk it. He approached the farmhouse quietly, ready to run if the door opened the wrong way. When the farmer appeared, a stout man with weathered hands and cautious eyes, Rudolf spoke in Slovak. His voice cracked from thirst. "We are Slovaks, escaped from Poland. Please, a little bread." The man studied him, then glanced toward Alfred, who stood a few paces behind, trembling. Something flickered in the farmer's eyes, fear, pity, perhaps both. He said nothing, only gestured for them to wait. Moments later he returned with bread and milk, setting them down on a stone without a word. Then he turned back into the house and closed the door. It was enough. They ate slowly, reverently, as though afraid the food might vanish. That night, they slept in a barn, hidden among hay and shadows. When dawn broke, the farmer left a small bundle for them, food, and a few old clothes that would help them blend in. Still, he said nothing. In times like those, silence was often the truest act of courage. With new strength, they continued south, heading towards Lena, where the Slovak Jewish Council had an office. If anyone could help them warn the world, it would be there. They walked by night, slipping between villages, hiding when they heard vehicles or voices. Zelina was small, quiet, a town of narrow streets and church bells that rang gently in the morning mist. When they arrived, they were almost delirious from exhaustion. A sympathetic contact guided them to a safe house where they could rest. There, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, they slept on beds, washed themselves, and changed into clean clothes. They were safe, at least for a moment. But safety brought with it a new torment: how to be believed. When they told the Jewish Council who they were and where they had come from, the room fell silent. The men around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Auschwitz, they knew, was a labor camp, perhaps even a harsh one, but extermination. Gas chambers? A mechanized death system for entire populations? One of the elders asked quietly. "Are you certain? Perhaps you misunderstood the purpose of the buildings you saw." Rudolf's temper flared, but Alfred placed a hand on his arm. "We have not misunderstood," he said evenly. "We were there." For days, they were questioned again and again. The council wanted details, numbers, routes, names, methods. They wanted proof. Proof of something almost too monstrous to fit within the human mind. So Rudolf and Alfred began to write. They wrote from memory, drawing maps of the camp, describing the crematoria, listing the numbers of arriving transports. They wrote about the selection process, how families were divided on the ramp, how the old and young were sent immediately to their deaths. They described the fake showers, the Zyklon B pellets, the piles of hair and gold teeth. They wrote for hours, then days, until more than 30 pages lay before them, the Vrba-Wetzler report, the first detailed eyewitness account of Auschwitz to reach the outside world. Rudolf's handwriting was sharp, urgent, almost angry. Alfred's was smaller, neater, like an engineer's blueprint. Between them, they built something that no denial could easily destroy. But even as the report took form, disbelief lingered. Some on the council feared that spreading such horror would only create panic, or be dismissed as propaganda. Others worried about retaliation if the Germans found out. Rudolf later recalled the frustration in his diary. "We had escaped from a kingdom of death, only to find ourselves imprisoned again by disbelief. Our words were treated like fevered dreams." Still, there were those who listened. A courier smuggled the report out of Slovakia. Copies were made, translated into Hungarian and German, and passed through underground channels. It reached the offices of diplomats, clergy, and eventually, the Allied governments. But that was still weeks away. In those early days in Zelina, Rudolf and Alfred could only wait, restless, haunted, uncertain whether the world would care enough to act. They walked through the quiet streets at dusk, keeping to the shadows. The air smelled of spring, damp earth, with smoke, lilac. Normal life carried on around them. Couples strolled by the river. A baker's boy whistled as he carried loaves down the lane. It must have seemed like another planet compared to where they had come from. One evening, as they sat by a window, Alfred said softly, "Do you think they'll believe us?" Rudolf looked out at the setting sun, its light washing the town in pale gold. "They must," he said. "If they don't, then all those who died will die again." Outside, the church bells began to toll, slow, deep notes that rolled through the valley. Somewhere far away, beyond hills and borders, trains were still arriving at Auschwitz. And in that moment, two men sat in a small Slovak town, clutching 30 pages of truth, hoping it might be enough to wake the world. Segue. But the world did not wake easily. In the next section, the report begins its perilous journey across Europe, through couriers, diplomats, and doubters, as Rudolf and Alfred wait to see whether their voices would finally be heard. There are moments in history when the truth moves quietly, not with trumpets, but with trembling hands passing thin papers through the dark. The Vrba-Wetzler report was one such truth. It began as a few handwritten pages in Zelina, and from there, it began to travel, first by foot, then by rail, then by rumor, as though carried by the wind itself. It was April 1944. The world was still deep in war, and Europe was divided by lines of occupation, fear, and disbelief. Words had lost much of their power. Propaganda had twisted reality so thoroughly that even the truth sounded like exaggeration. And yet, within those 30 pages, two men had written something that refused to be silenced. The Jewish Council in Zelina sent the report through its contacts to Bratislava, where members of the underground Slovak resistance began to make copies. From there, it was smuggled into Hungary, a country then facing its own catastrophe. The Germans had invaded only weeks before, and deportations of Hungarian Jews had already begun. Every train that left Hungary for labor camps was, in truth, heading toward the crematoria of Auschwitz. Rudolf and Alfred's report had arrived just in time, perhaps too late for some, but not yet for all. In Bratislava, a priest named Father Krunislav Draganovic, who was secretly helping Jewish refugees, read the report in disbelief. He later wrote that he had to stop reading several times because his hands were shaking. "It was like staring into the heart of an eclipse," he said. "You could not look for long without feeling blinded." From Bratislava, the report made its way into diplomatic circles. It reached Switzerland, carried by couriers of the Vrba-Wetzler, a Jewish rescue committee. There, a man named George Montello, the first secretary of the El Salvador consulate in Geneva, received a copy. Montello was horrified. He decided that secrecy was no longer an option. He released the report publicly, distributing copies to journalists, church leaders, and government officials. Soon newspapers in Switzerland began printing the details: gas chambers, crematoria, deportations, numbers, names. It was the first time much of the Western world had seen a detailed description of Auschwitz in print. But even then, disbelief lingered. Editors hesitated. Politicians looked away. Some said the descriptions were too graphic to be true. Others said it was impossible, that no civilized nation could commit such acts on such a scale. And yet, as more corroborating evidence surfaced, intercepted radio messages, survivor testimonies, eyewitness accounts, the report's credibility grew. In June 1944, summaries of the Vrba-Wetzler report reached the Vatican, the U.S. State Department, and British intelligence. For the first time, the names Auschwitz and Birkenau appeared in diplomatic cables not as vague references, but as real places of mechanized death. Rudolf Vrba, meanwhile, remained in hiding in Slovakia. He had become a fugitive of truth, a man who had seen too much, said too much, and now lived between worlds. He later recalled in his memoir how strange those days were. We were free, but not free. We had escaped, but our minds had not left the camp. Each night, I dreamed of the ramp, of the children's shoes. I woke up gasping, and I remembered I am here. I must make them listen. When he and Alfred learned that their report had reached Switzerland, they allowed themselves a brief smile. Not joy, not relief, but something quieter, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Still, their warning had come too late for many. The deportations from Hungary had already begun in earnest. Between May and July of 1944, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, most murdered within hours of arrival. But not all. Because of the report, and the growing outcry it caused, the world began to stir. The BBC broadcasted news of the atrocities. The Vatican sent urgent appeals to Hungary's regent, Miklos Horthy, urging him to stop the deportations. The Swedish and Swiss governments joined in protest. And finally, in July 1944, Horthy halted the transports, just weeks before the last Hungarian Jewish communities were scheduled to be destroyed. Historians later estimated that the Vrba-Wetzler report helped save as many as 200,000 lives. I sometimes imagine those two men, now in hiding, unaware of the ripples they had set in motion, sitting in a quiet room in Zelina, perhaps sharing a loaf of bread, their bodies still frail but their eyes alive with purpose. They could not have known that their words had reached the Pope, the Allied leaders, the Red Cross. They only knew that they had spoken the truth, and that truth was now moving faster than fear. And yet, for Rudolf, the victory was not pure. In later years, he would speak of a bitterness that lingered. If they had believed sooner, he said, perhaps the trains could have been stopped before. We were shouting into the wind. But history rarely listens all at once. It takes time for disbelief to crack, for conscience to awaken. The report, written by two skeletal men in a borrowed room, had done something few weapons could. It had pierced the silence. The quiet world of Switzerland, with its calm lakes and neutral papers, had become the first echo chamber for their truth. From there, the words spread across borders, across languages, across hearts. Even now, when I read the dry lines of that report, gas introduced after 3 minutes, corpses removed after 30, capacity per day estimated at 10,000, I feel a kind of tremor. It is not only horror, but reverence. These were not just statistics. They were the desperate attempt of two human beings to record the unrecordable. They had done what seemed impossible, escaped from the heart of hell and made the world look at it. Segue. But escape and truth come with a price. In the next section, we follow what became of Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler after their warning reached the world, their lives after the war, and how memory itself became both burden and duty. Freedom, when it finally arrived, felt quieter than either man had imagined. No crowds greeted them, no trumpets announced their victory. There was only stillness, and the echo of everything they had seen. After the Vrba-Wetzler report had spread across Europe, Rudolf and Alfred remained in Slovakia, living under false identities. The war was still raging, and both men were marked by the Gestapo as fugitives. Even among their own, they were treated with a strange mixture of awe and caution, as if they had returned from a world no one wanted to imagine existed. In late 1944, Rudolf joined the Slovak national uprising, fighting with partisans in the hills and forests he had once crossed as an escapee. He carried a rifle now, but it was not vengeance that drove him, it was purpose. "I fought," he wrote later, "not to kill, but to prevent the forgetting." Each shot, he said, felt like a punctuation mark at the end of an unspeakable sentence. When the war finally ended, and the camps were liberated, the scale of what they had witnessed was confirmed. Photographs and testimonies flooded the world, heaps of shoes, skeletal survivors, the hollow eyes of children too weak to stand. The newspapers that had once hesitated to believe now printed the truth in bold black letters. But for Rudolf and Alfred, vindication brought no peace. Truth, once freed, does not easily rest. They were both summoned to testify before commissions, investigators, and journalists. Their report was read aloud in tribunals. Yet even as they spoke, they felt the same ache, that no matter how many words they found, the experience itself could never be translated. "There are languages," Rudolf once said, "that only the dead can speak." After the war, they drifted apart. Alfred Wetzler returned to his hometown, married, and took a quiet job as a clerk. He rarely spoke of Auschwitz. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit by the window and watch the sky darken. His daughter once said he looked as though he were listening for something far away, the faint echo of a place that refused to leave him. He published a book years later, under a pseudonym, titled What Dante Did Not See. Even the title suggested that language had limits, that what he had known existed beyond poetry, beyond hell, beyond words. Rudolf's path was different. He studied chemistry at university, driven by a need to understand structure, how things fit, how systems could be built and broken. Science, he said, was a way of proving that the world could be logical again. But logic was fragile. The nightmares remained. Sometimes he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing the whistle of trains that no longer ran. He changed his name officially to Rudolf Vrba, as if to mark a new life, one that belonged to the world after Auschwitz. He moved first to Prague, then to Israel, and finally to Canada, where he became a professor of pharmacology at the University of British Columbia. In photographs from that time, he looks calm, professorial, but the eyes betray a certain distance, a gaze that seems to look both at you and through you. He was brilliant, outspoken, sometimes difficult. He gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and continued to remind the world that knowledge carries responsibility. "I do not believe in divine justice," he once said in a lecture. "I believe in human memory. That is all we have to stand against the abyss." Despite the recognition he eventually received, Rudolf was haunted by the idea that the world had moved on too easily. The war had ended, nations were rebuilding, and people wanted stories of courage and victory, not of ash and silence. He saw how quickly horror could fade into history, and history into abstraction. "To forget," he said bitterly, "is to commit the same crime again, only more politely." He also felt betrayed by some leaders of the wartime Jewish councils, who he believed had withheld information from their communities, fearing panic. His views were controversial, sometimes divisive. But he refused to soften them. "The truth," he wrote, "is not comfort. It is clarity, And clarity is often cruel. Alfred, more private by nature, disagreed quietly. We must also learn to live, he said in one of his few public talks. To live without being consumed by the past is also a kind of victory. Two men, bound by the same memory, but walking in opposite directions through the same shadow. Years passed. Decades even. The snow of Auschwitz melted long ago, though its ashes remained in the soil. Rudolf continued to speak publicly, his voice growing quieter but never less certain. He spoke not as a victim, but as a witness, calm, deliberate, almost like a historian dictating the record of an ancient tragedy. He carried in him that rare and dangerous gift, the ability to remember precisely what the rest of the world would rather forget. In 1985, in an interview filmed for a documentary, the interviewer asked him, "Do you still believe it mattered, what you did?" Rudolf paused for a long time before answering. Then he smiled faintly and said, "If even one life was saved because of our words, then it mattered. And if not, then we tried, and that too is something." As I read those lines, I can almost hear his voice, soft, steady, with the kind of stillness that comes only from living alongside ghosts. He had survived the unimaginable, and yet he never allowed survival to become an ending. For him, survival was the beginning of duty. And when he died, in 2006, the newspapers wrote of him as the man who escaped Auschwitz to tell the world. But I think he would have wanted something simpler. A man who carried the truth too far to ever put it down. Segue. And yet, beyond the personal story of Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler lies a larger question. How does the world remember? In the next section, we trace how their report shaped history itself, influencing war crimes trials, historical memory, and the very way humanity understands evil. The report that Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler carried across the mountains did not end when they put down their pens. It lived on, quietly, persistently, like a pulse beneath the surface of post-war Europe. In the months following the war, their words were translated into multiple languages and presented at the Nuremberg trials. The document, titled the Auschwitz Protocols, stood as one of the earliest and most detailed eyewitness testimonies of the final solution. Judges read it in solemn silence. Translators whispered through its horrors line by line. The world that had doubted two weary escapees now held their account as legal truth. But history, I've found, moves strangely. It doesn't march, it drifts, folds, forgets, and remembers again. The report that once burned through the conscience of nations slowly turned into a citation, a reference in archives, a few paragraphs in textbooks. Its authors receded behind the magnitude of their subject. The story of the Holocaust became vast, and in vastness, names often blur. Yet there were those who never let the blurring begin. In classrooms, in small museums, in homes where survivors whispered to their children, the names Vrba and Wetzler still carried a kind of sacred electricity. They were the ones who had seen and spoken. They proved that resistance could take the form of words, not just weapons. I remember once holding a copy of their original report in a dim reading room, the pages brittle, typed unevenly, the paper thin as onion skin. The words were not poetic, they were blunt, precise, almost scientific. Convoy after convoy, one line read, arrives with approximately 1,500 persons, of whom 300 are selected for labor. The remainder are gassed within 2 hours. It was the coldness of the phrasing that hurt the most, the way the unimaginable had been rendered into routine. And yet, in that very restraint, there was courage. They did not seek to horrify. They sought to record. After the war, historians would call their work the beginning of documentation, the moment when the moral duty of witnessing was transformed into an act of preservation. From their example would grow the later efforts to record survivor testimonies, the foundations of museums and archives, the insistence that memory must have structure if it is to survive time. Still, remembrance is not simple. In the decades that followed, the world wrestled with how to look back. Some nations built memorials, vast and solemn. Others turned away, busy with rebuilding. In Czechoslovakia, where Rudolf and Alfred had once lived, communist censorship muffled many individual stories, framing them only through political narratives. It would take until the 1990s for their full story to be widely known in the West. By then, Rudolf was teaching in Canada, still giving interviews, still reminding students that evil is often organized, not monstrous, that it relies on ordinary people obeying extraordinary cruelty. He spoke with the clarity of someone who had seen the machinery of genocide from within. The system, he told one class, was built on a simple idea: if you make murder routine, it ceases to shock. That is why you must never allow yourself to grow used to injustice. Those who heard him often described a peculiar calm in his tone, not anger, but a kind of weary precision, as though he had spent his life trying to carve meaning out of chaos, and this was the closest he could come. He never forgave silence. Silence, he believed, was what allowed the chimneys to keep burning. Meanwhile, in Slovakia, Alfred Wetzler's book began to gain recognition. What Dante did not see became a cornerstone of Slovak Holocaust literature. Schools began to teach excerpts from it, and young people retraced his and Rudolf's escape route through the Carpathian Mountains. Each year, hundreds walk that path now, a quiet pilgrimage known as the Vrba-Wetzler Memorial March. They climb the same slopes, rest in the same forests, and light candles along the border where freedom first began. The forest, once filled with fear, now holds the murmurs of gratitude. When I first saw footage of the march, I was struck by the faces: students, survivors' descendants, strangers from many nations walking in silence. The sound of their footsteps against the damp leaves reminded me of what Alfred once wrote. The forest was silent, but it listened. And perhaps that is what memory truly is, not a story we tell, but a listening that never ends. There is, in every remembrance, an undertone of guilt, that we are alive to remember what others did not live to tell. But Rudolf often said remembrance should not be guilt, it should be responsibility. He compared it to tending a flame. You cannot bring back the fire that has burned out, but you can keep the light it left behind. It is strange how even today, his report still finds new readers. Scholars continue to study it, writers quote from it, and yet, when one reads it alone, under a lamp's soft glow, the text feels almost private, a whisper across time. In that whisper, the boundaries between past and present dissolve. It is not just history, it is warning. When I close my eyes, I imagine the two men, older now, their lives long diverged, walking once more in that quiet Slovak forest. Perhaps they say little. Perhaps they don't need to. Between them, the silence holds everything they endured, everything they told, everything that could never be told. Their journey did not end in Auschwitz, nor in the escape, nor even in survival. It continues in every act of remembrance that dares to speak when silence seems easier. As the years turn, as the last survivors fade, their voices remain, not loud, but enduring, steady, like a lantern burning through the centuries. Segue. In the next section, we will step back from the men themselves and explore how their warning changed the course of rescue efforts during the war, and how, tragically, some of those efforts came too late. History, at its heart, is a story about timing. Sometimes the truth arrives just when it can change the course of things, and sometimes it comes a moment too late, like a telegram that finds its recipient only after the storm has passed. The Vrba-Wetzler report sat cruelly between those two moments. When Rudolf and Alfred escaped in April of 1944, the Nazi regime was preparing for one of the last great deportations of the war, the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. More than 400,000 Jews were still living in Hungary, and until then, they had been relatively untouched. The Germans moved fast. By mid-May, trains were already rolling from Hungary to Auschwitz, each filled with thousands who believed they were being resettled. Rudolf and Alfred's report, describing in precise, almost clinical detail what happened to those who arrived at Auschwitz, was meant to stop those trains. They wrote of the crematoria, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the precise capacity of the ovens. They recorded train schedules, numbers of victims, the names of SS officers. They gave the world no excuse to claim ignorance. Copies of the report reached Switzerland, where diplomats and journalists began to circulate it through neutral channels. One of the first to act was George Montello, a Jewish diplomat in Geneva. When he read the report, he wept, and then he printed thousands of copies. He plastered walls with headlines, sent summaries to churches and embassies, and organized protests in the streets. Swiss citizens marched with signs that read, "Stop the massacres!" One of the rare moments of public outcry during the war. Soon, the document reached the Vatican, London, and Washington. Leaders who had long heard rumors of extermination now had, in their hands, undeniable proof. On June 26, 1944, the BBC broadcast a detailed summary of the report. A few days later, the New York Times published it on page 6, not the front page, but visible enough to reach thousands. That same week, diplomats from several nations appealed directly to the Hungarian regent, Miklós Horthy, urging him to halt the deportations. Among them was Pope Pius XII, who sent a rare and urgent plea. Even President Roosevelt's administration issued a statement warning that those responsible for atrocities would be held accountable. And then, something extraordinary happened. On July 7, 1944, under immense international pressure, Horthy ordered the deportations to cease. It was the first and only time during the Holocaust that mass killings were slowed by international protest. Hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews, perhaps as many as 200,000, were spared immediate deportation because of that pause. It was, in part, because two men had crawled under barbed wire, walked through forests, and refused to remain silent. Yet the victory was bittersweet. By the time the deportation stopped, nearly 437,000 Hungarian Jews had already been sent to Auschwitz. The gas chambers at Birkenau worked at full capacity that summer, the sky was thick with smoke, and the river by the camp ran dark with ash. Vrba and Wetzler had escaped in time to warn, but not in time to save them all. I often imagine how that knowledge must have sat in Rudolf's chest. He once said in an interview, "I believed that if people knew, they would act. I was wrong about the timing, not about the people." There was no bitterness in his tone, only sorrow at how slow truth can travel. The irony of it is unbearable, that their report, written in exhaustion and fear, did reach the world, and yet the machinery of death had already gained too much momentum to stop entirely. The story is often told as tragedy, but perhaps it's better seen as proof that truth can break through, even when the world prefers not to hear it. In later years, historians would debate the impact of the report. Some argued it saved thousands of lives. Others claimed the Allies could have done more if they had acted faster. The truth, as always, lies between numbers and memory. But what remains certain is that their testimony forced the world to see. In the small Swiss towns where Montello's posters appeared, churches rang their bells in mourning. In London, clergymen held vigils for the unnamed. In Washington, officials discussed whether bombing the railway lines to Auschwitz might help, though they never did. The ripples reached even to Stockholm, where Raoul Wallenberg, inspired by the growing outcry, began issuing protective passports to Hungarian Jews. His mission, which would save tens of thousands, began just days after Horthy's halt order, and was influenced, historians believe, by the alarm the Vrba-Wetzler report had sounded. So their act did not vanish into the void. It echoed quietly, through the corridors of diplomacy, through moral decisions made in haste, through every heart that beat faster upon reading their words. A small candle, perhaps, but even a small candle changes the shape of darkness. As I sit here now, reading their testimonies by the dim light of my desk lamp, I think about timing again. They did not know who would read their words, nor when. They wrote not for fame, nor revenge, but for a stranger somewhere, someday, who might choose to act. History often forgets how fragile that act is, how every decision to speak, to warn, to bear witness, is a race against time itself. And in that race, they ran until their bodies gave out. Still, their warning reached the world. And though too late for some, it was just in time for others. And perhaps, in the vast moral accounting of history, that sliver of time, those saved lives, were enough. Segue. But the story of Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler does not end with warnings or wars. In the next section, we turn to what followed, how survival became both a burden and a calling, and how memory, in the years that followed, shaped not only them, but the conscience of the world. When wars end, the silence that follows is often louder than the gunfire. For Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler, the silence of peace was a new kind of trial, the trial of living among the unscarred. The world moved on with the rhythm of reconstruction. Cities rebuilt. Markets reopened. The rubble of Europe began to hum again with life. But inside the minds of those who had seen the camps, there remained a strange dissonance, the sound of memory that refused to fade. Rudolf and Alfred were no longer prisoners of barbed wire and guard towers. They were prisoners of recollection. And like so many survivors, they discovered that escape from Auschwitz was not truly an escape at all, only a change of landscape. Alfred returned to Czechoslovakia, quiet, deliberate, and wary of questions. The war had taken his youth. What remained, he tried to fill with small routines. He married, worked as a clerk, raised a family. His neighbors knew him as a reserved man who preferred long walks to conversation. But sometimes, late at night, he would sit in his study with the radio off and the window open, as if listening for something that only he could hear, perhaps the faint echo of a train, the murmur of languages no longer spoken. He never stopped writing. His memoir, What Dante Did Not See, was both testimony and exorcism. In it he did not rage. He observed. The heart learns to beat softly in a place where silence is safer than hope. He wrote. That line, more than any other, captures the ache of those who returned from hell and found themselves misunderstood by the living. Rudolf, by contrast, seemed determined to live against silence. Where Alfred withdrew, Rudolf spoke. Where others hesitated, he confronted. He had become a man made entirely of purpose, sometimes sharp-edged, sometimes exhausting, but always unwilling to let the truth sink quietly into history. He emigrated first to Israel, then to London, and finally to Canada. He became a scientist, a teacher, a husband, and a restless soul. In lectures, he spoke not of horror, but of mechanisms, of how obedience and bureaucracy can become instruments of evil. His tone was calm, almost professorial. But beneath that composure was fire. He believed that the true danger of Auschwitz was not its brutality, but its efficiency. It was not chaos that killed millions, he said, it was order. Lists, timetables, calculations, all used in service of annihilation. This, he told his students, is what happens when human beings learn to follow instructions without asking why. The war had turned him into both witness and philosopher. He wrote essays, gave interviews, appeared in documentaries. Yet each time he told his story, he seemed to grow both lighter and lonelier, as if memory was both burning and consuming him. There was one theme he returned to often: the failure of early warning. He believed that Jewish leaders in Hungary, and even the Allies, could have done more if they had taken his reports seriously sooner. This conviction haunted him. "If they had believed us fully," he said once, "hundreds of thousands might have been saved." Those words divided some listeners, but Rudolf never softened them. To him, memory was sacred not because it comforted, but because it accused. I sometimes think about what it must have felt like to carry such a burden, to live decades knowing that your truth had come just days too late. And yet, even in that pain, there was defiance. He refused to see himself as a victim. "I did not survive Auschwitz," he wrote. "I escaped from it." The distinction mattered deeply to him. Survival, he believed, implied passivity, endurance. Escape meant action, agency, resistance. Even language, for him, was a battlefield. And in his resistance, he found a kind of immortality. In the 1990s, as Holocaust education expanded, his name began to appear in textbooks and museums. Students learned about the Vrba-Wetzler report not as a footnote, but as a turning point. He became a living witness, walking through history classes and auditoriums with his calm, deliberate voice, a man who had once fled the gates of death to tell the world what he saw. But memory takes a toll. In private letters, he admitted that he often dreamed of the camp, of the wire, of the smell of burnt wood and flesh. "I cannot unsee it," he confessed. "I can only live beside it." And perhaps that is what memory does. It does not vanish, it merely takes a seat beside you at the table of your life. When he passed away in 2006, the headlines remembered him for his escape, for his warning, for his courage. But I think his true legacy lies in something quieter: his refusal to forget. In one of his final interviews, he was asked whether he believed humanity had learned anything from the Holocaust. He paused for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps," he said, "we have learned that evil does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a smile, or a suit, or a rulebook. Remember that. It is a simple truth, but like all simple truths, it grows heavier the longer you hold it. And so the weight of memory, his, Alfred's, and all who lived, remains with us. Not to burden, but to balance. Not to haunt, but to warn. As I sit here now, the fire in my study crackling softly, I think of them as old men in different corners of the world, one silent, one speaking, both remembering. The war ended long ago, but the remembering never did. And perhaps that is what it means to truly survive. Segue. As we come to the final part of this story, we'll look not at the men themselves, but at what they left behind, the legacy of truth, the fragile art of remembrance, and how even a single act of courage can echo through generations. There is a quiet dignity in the way truth outlives its tellers. Long after Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler had faded into history, their words continued to move, like ripples across an endless pond. The ink on their report had long since dried, but the conscience it stirred never quite settled. In classrooms around the world, their story is now told to students who were born half a century after the last train left Auschwitz. To them, the war is not a memory but a map of human possibility, of what can happen when silence triumphs over courage. Yet, as they read the report, as they hear of two young men who crawled beneath barbed wire armed only with truth, something shifts in the air. History breathes again. It is remarkable to think that two figures, half-starved, nameless fugitives at the time, altered the course of moral understanding. Their story reminds us that resistance is not always loud, nor heroic in the traditional sense. Sometimes it is simply the act of walking, step after step through the forest, carrying the unbearable weight of knowledge. Their escape became a legend, but their purpose was never fame. It was urgency, the kind that comes from knowing that every minute costs lives. That urgency, even now, feels alive when one reads their words. The precise numbers, the descriptions of buildings and procedures, the lists of names, these are not merely historical details. They are the architecture of remembrance. They built, line by line, a monument out of language. In modern-day Slovakia and Poland, memorial marches trace the route of their escape each spring. Hundreds walk from Auschwitz, the town beside Auschwitz, through forests and hills to Zelina, retracing those desperate days. Candles flicker in hands, flags rustle softly in mountain winds. No speeches are made, no banners wave. Only the steady sound of footsteps, like a heartbeat stretched across generations. I imagine Rudolf and Alfred would have approved, not because of ceremony, but because of simplicity. The truth, they believed, should be walked with humility. In the quiet corners of museums, their report lies open under glass. The typewriter ink has faded to a soft brown. Sometimes a visitor bends close to read the fine print, tracing the lines with their eyes. In that act, something sacred happens, a dialogue between past and present. It is as if Rudolf and Alfred are whispering still, look closely. Do not forget. And perhaps that is their truest legacy, not that they warned the world once, but that their warning continues to echo each time someone remembers. The Holocaust is now a subject of study, of art, of philosophy. It has been written about, debated, denied, defended, memorialized. Yet amid all of that, the simple human truth remains. Two men risked everything to speak, and by doing so, they proved that conscience is the most enduring rebellion of all. As a historian, I often sit surrounded by photographs and documents from that time. Some are blurred by age, some are unbearably sharp. I study faces, thousands of them, and wonder what became of each. In this endless archive of loss, the Vrba-Wetzler report feels like a pulse. It reminds me that behind every statistic lies a heartbeat once counted, a breath once taken, a name once whispered in the dark. In a letter written years after the war, Alfred reflected on their journey. "Sometimes I wonder if we truly escaped," he wrote. "Perhaps part of us still walks in that forest, carrying the names of those who could not. It's a haunting thought that escape, in the deepest sense, is impossible. But maybe it isn't meant to be. Maybe memory is the price of freedom." And for Rudolf, memory was not a burden, it was armor. He wore it through lectures and interviews, through the indifference of later decades, through the weariness of growing old. He said once, "If I must live with ghosts, then I will make them speak." He did. They both did. As the 20th century closed, as survivors grew few, their story found new life in documentaries, in classrooms, in the digital ether of remembrance. New generations watched the black and white footage, heard the soft, deliberate voice of Rudolf recounting what he had seen, and realized that truth, once spoken, never truly dies. And now, as I speak their story to you, perhaps somewhere out there, a listener lying in the quiet of night, imagines two thin figures stepping through the mist of a spring forest, hearts pounding, carrying the truth like a fragile flame cupped between trembling hands. That image, more than any monument, is their legacy. It is a reminder that history's greatest act of courage may be the decision to tell what you have seen, even when no one wishes to hear it. And so, their footsteps continue. Through forests. Through memory. Through the very soul of the modern world. When I close my eyes, I see them still. Two shadows against a field of snow. The wind whispering through the pines. The stars indifferent witnesses above. They do not speak, for speech is heavy. They walk, and the world sleeps. They carry not weapons nor maps. But something far more dangerous, truth. Truth that burns without flame. Truth that survives the silence of history. Truth, that makes its home in those who dare to remember. Years have folded into years. The camps are quiet now. Their wire rusted, their watchtowers leaning like tired ghosts. But the truth they carried walks still. Through classrooms, through pages. Through the hearts of those who listen in the dark. And perhaps, if you listen closely enough, you can hear it too. The sound of footsteps fading softly into dawn. And the low, unending murmur of a promise kept. Never again.